Good evening, everyone, and welcome to TIFF Bell Lightbox. My name is Pierce Handling. I'm Director and CEO of TIFF. My distinct pleasure to welcome you this evening for our screening of Lest We Forget with Canadian War Museum historian and best-selling author Tim Cook. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that tonight's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We're very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa, and our public supporters, Ontario Creates and the Canada Council for the Arts. And as a charitable organization, we would also like to thank our donors and members for making TIFF's year-round programming and educational and community outreach initiatives possible. Now, 2 days ago, we marked the 100th anniversary of the armistice and the end of the First World War. Tonight's event is part of a series to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the armistice. From now until December the 9th, we will screen the very best cinematic depictions of the 20th century's first modern war. For information on the films in the series, please visit our website, tiff.net. And at this time, I'd like to just highlight a few of the guests who will be coming up in the next couple of days. On Thursday, day after tomorrow, before a screening of Officers' Ward at La Chambre des Officiers, Canadian Armed Forces veteran and 2017 Invictus Games athlete Mike Trauner will discuss his experiences being wounded in combat, the challenging processes of rehabilitation, and his personal journey of healing. And on Thursday, November 29th, Jonathan F. Vance, who is a professor at Western University and a military historian with expertise on prisoners of war, will introduce Jean Renoir's classic La Grande Illusion. We'll be presenting a new 4K digital restoration of this film. And to conclude our series on December 9th, Leah Cuff will be here to reflect on her own experiences of sending her husband, Mike Trauner, to war and what his journey to recovery has been like for the two of them. And she'll appear before a screening of the French film Les Gardiennes. Now, before we screen the film, I'd just like to remind you to please place your phones on silent. And Tim and I will be back for a short Q&A after the screening of the film to answer your questions. So there'll be a microphone circulating. Now, Tim Cook is one of Canada's preeminent historians, military historians, and the author of numerous books, particularly focusing on the First World War. His two-volume history on the Canadian contribution at the Sharp End and Shock Troops is authoritative, thoroughly researched, and beautifully written. He had also published a book on the fights between Arthur Currie, who commanded the Canadian Corps, and Sam Hughes, the Canadian Minister of Militia and Defence during the First World War, entitled The Madman and the Butcher. And his book on Vimy is also a must-read. He's also published a two-volume history on our participation in the Second World War, and has just recently released a new book, also in the First War, The Secret History of Soldiers, How Canadians Survived the Great War. His books have won many, many awards. He's twice won the C.P. Stacey Award, twice won the J.W. Defoe Award, Ottawa Book Award, the Charles Taylor Award. He's also written a very thorough article on tonight's film, Lest We Forget, Canada's official First World War film, produced by the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau, which was the precursor of the National Film Board. It gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight's guest, Tim Cook.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've walked by this amazing building for many years, never had a chance to come up, and what a delight it is for me tonight, both to speak to you, but to see this film on the large screen. And it really is a fabulous film. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the First World War, a little bit on how we know, or what we know about how the film was shot by the combat cameramen, the period after the war, and a little bit to the reaction. I don't want to give away the film, although it's really a documentary, I think, but I do want to set the context for you. I think what's interesting about this is it carries the title of Canada's official First World War film. That's quite unique, and that title of official, I think, is often viewed as publicity, puffery, even propaganda. But that was not the case in the 1930s. The official title meant that this was the government's official telling of this war, this terrible war that had consumed so many young men and which changed forever our country. It meant that this was an authentic film and that it was using the official archival film footage that had never been shown before in its entirety to tell a story. And so it was quite unique for the time. The war itself was momentous for Canada. It was the hardest thing we had ever done to that point in our history, 50 years almost since Confederation. Canada found itself automatically at war on the 4th of August, 1914, but Canadians would decide the level of extent of their commitment. It could have been like the South African War. We might have had 8,000 or 9,000 Canadians who served in this European war, as it was initially, before it became a world war. But tens of thousands of Canadians enlisted, then hundreds of thousands, and eventually, of course, we know that some 620,000 Canadians would serve or be conscripted, about 1 in 3 adult males. It was an incredible exertion from a very small, young country of only about 8 million. The war required the mobilization of the home front. This was an unlimited war effort, maybe a total war effort. We were an agrarian country, and it shouldn't be surprising that we produced food for the Allied nations. We sent overseas in 1915 alone 400 million bushels of wheat. We fed the Western armies, and this was during a time when all the young men were leaving their farms to join the fighting forces. And by 1916, there would be food shortages throughout Europe. Canada's wheat played a key role in feeding the British and the French armies in the field, as well as the Canadians when they arrived in February of 1915. We contributed an enormous number of shells to the war effort. Canada had no munitions industry before the war. There was no need to have a munitions industry. We had one factory that produced the Ross rifle, which was a Canadian-made rifle that wasn't particularly good and jammed on the battlefield. But by 1917, we had over 600 companies or factories employing 250,000 Canadians. And in 1917, that year, 1/3 of all the shells fired by the British Army were made in Canada. An incredible contribution. But perhaps the greatest contribution was our fighting forces. The primary fighting force was the Canadian Corps, and you'll hear about that tonight. By late 1916, 4 divisions strong, 100,000 soldiers, having fought at the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, where they withstood the chlorine gas attack, the place where John McCrae wrote his poem in Flanders Fields. They fought on the Somme. They fought at Vimy in April of 1917, delivering victory. In June of 1917, a Canadian took command of the Corps, Sir Arthur Currie, Canadian-born, a Victoria real estate developer who had a very good mind for war and listened to his staff officers and was continually learning on the Western Front. The Canadians delivered victory at Hill 70 in August of 1917, in the mud and the unburied corpses of Passchendaele in October and November of 1917, and during the 100 Days campaign, probably the most important series of battles, where the Canadians spearheaded the assault on the 8th of August 1918 with the Australians at Amiens. That was a war where everyone expected the fighting to go into 1919, even 1920. Amiens rocked the Germans. It showed that the war could possibly be won in 1918, and it was, but it came at a terrible cost. The Canadian Corps fighting in a series of battles at Amiens, at Arras, capturing Cambrai, finally liberating Mons on the last day of the war, suffered 45,000 casualties in those victories. Victories at a terrible cost. The war had propelled Canada forward onto the world stage. We had stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain. Our Prime Minister of the day, Sir Robert Borden, demanded that Canada have a signature on the Treaty of Versailles. It was a symbolic signature, but it was important. We joined the League of Nations. These things would have been unthinkable in 1914. And yet we were also a country that was fractured and broken from the extremity of the war effort, primarily the conscription crisis that forced young men to serve against their will. And I think the losses, the terrible losses, 61,000 battlefield dead, some 66,000 by 1921 when those in those 2.5 years died of their wounds or died from the flu. Those terrible losses weighed heavily on the country. They were a dark legacy. And the Canadians who came back to the country came back to a country that was changed and fractured and angry. It was in debt, $2 billion. The introduction of income tax had not helped to alleviate that debt. English were set against French. Farmers were set against those in the cities. Organized labor was mobilizing. 1919 was a very difficult year for Canada. As veterans came back, there weren't enough jobs for them. Women who had entered the workforce were forced to leave their jobs. It was a dark time. Canada was never the same after the First World War. Harder to govern, proud of our service, grieving over our fallen, wondering what to do with 170,000 wounded veterans, about half of them seriously wounded. We were forced to create a new medical care system. That's an important legacy of the war. And of course, we built memorials across the country, some 4,000 in every city, every town, every village. National monuments, maybe our most powerful monument at Vimy, all to mark the fallen. And that's, I think, where this film comes in. There was a desire to create an official film to document this momentous war. What is ironic about this is when Canada was mobilizing tens and then hundreds of thousands of soldiers, almost nobody in Ottawa thought about documenting this war. It fell to Sir Max Aitken, later Lord Beaverbrook, that mischievous gnome-like figure bounding through Canadian history, making tens of millions of dollars through all kinds of schemes and scams in Canada before going overseas, buying up newspapers, becoming a member of Parliament. When the war started, he hoped to be in Asquith's government. Asquith couldn't stand him, and so Sir Max set about trying to find another way to contribute to the war effort. And he wrote to his friend, Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia, and he wrote to Sir Robert Borden, the Prime Minister, and they said, why don't you document the war? And he liked that idea, so he called himself Canada's official recorder. He would have other titles, but his job was to publicize the Canadian war effort and to leave a historical legacy. I find this incredible that Lord Beaverbrook was thinking along these lines, this really titanic figure of history, who of course would become Minister of Aircraft Production during the Second War, a foul-weather friend to Churchill, kingmaker to all kinds of politicians in Britain. And here he was, leaving a historical legacy. How did he do it? By 1916, he used his own considerable fortune to create official photographers, filmmakers, and war artists. And by the summer of 1916, dozens of Canadians in uniform were behind the lines, painting the Western Front, or photographing the soldiers, or filming. And he had to fight his way through censorship. The British military didn't want any of this. Lord Beaverbrook took no, would not accept no as an answer, and he bludgeoned his way forward. And eventually, we were filming, and I'll focus on that, although there are about 8,000 photographs from the war, and there are about 1,000 works of art that were painted by 100 artists, including Jackson and Lismer and others. The film, however, was fascinating. The small film crews of 3 would move along the Western Front. Nobody quite knew what they were doing there. They were continually being arrested by military police. But they filmed the Battle of the Somme, where the Canadians fought from September to November of 1916. And they captured on film some of the first film footage of the tank that was introduced at the Battle of Courcelette on the 15th of September, a Canadian victory. And it was stunning footage, and it was shown throughout the British Empire, and I think you'll see it in the film tonight. But there was no easy way to film combat on the Western Front with the dust and debris and the explosions, and snipers just as happy to shoot a cameraman as they were an infantryman. And the Vimy footage was very poor. The cameraman, in fact, doesn't appear to have actually made it to the front. And Beaverbrook was furious, and he fired him, and he tried to entice other British combat cameramen to the front, and they filmed a number of campaigns. One of them was B McDowell, very good British combat cameraman who wrote a memoir, which is useful, except it's utterly self-serving. It's almost like Forrest Gump. He seems to have been everywhere on the Western Front and done everything. But there are glimpses of how he filmed the front. And I found an official document where he was officially scolded for endangering himself at Passchendaele. He was desperate to get footage of the Canadians in the bog of mud and unburied corpses, and he was exposing himself to danger, and one of the officers basically had to pull him back. There's better footage towards the end of the war, the 100 Days campaign, those series of battles I was talking about. The cameramen were able to follow the Canadians in those victories and capture a lot of that, and you'll see that tonight as well. The Canadians had among the best film footage from the war, and Beaverbrook was lauded for this, and in fact the British were quite angry about this. They thought the Canadians were overrepresented. And in fact, there's one memo from a senior British general who says, it looks like there's no one else fighting on the Western Front except for the Canadians. Beaverbrook was made Minister of Information in mid-1918, which meant he was in charge of all of the propaganda, and he continued to support the Canadians. When the war ended, the 250,000 soldiers who were overseas went home. Most of them were home by the summer of 1919. As I said before, they came back to a broken, fractured country. What also came back were the 1,000 works of art and the 8,000 or so photographs and the film footage. But as Piers alluded to, there was no CBC at the time. There was no National Film Board at the time. And so these priceless nitrate films sat in a vault at D&D, at the historical section, where no one seemed to know what to do with them. And periodically they would burst into flames, as nitrate film does, and they would be lost, and a number of priceless films were lost during this time. In the 1920s, there was a desire, as we were memorializing the war, to build a museum in Ottawa. And this museum would be a memorial, and it would house the war art collection, and it would have a permanent theater to show the film. That museum was never built. Successive governments decided not to build it. And by the late 20s, that museum had been strangled in the crib. There was an increasing call by the Legion to have an official film. They wanted a document to talk about their experiences. There was supposed to be an 8-volume official history written. They assigned a decorated military engineer instead of a historian, and it took him 21 years to get the first volume out, which came out in 1938, and he never got another volume out. The film looked like it was going to have the same sad story, lost, catching on fire, until the early 30s, where a number of ministers in Bennett's government, responding to the Legion, said, yes, we will make a film. And a number of important cultural leaders in Ottawa, including Sir Arthur Doughty, the public archivist of the day, and a number of decorated veterans and journalists, wrote a script. And they wrote the script in 1934, and I've seen the script. It's very interesting, crossing out how they're going to tell these stories. We have to remember, of course, this was a very difficult time. Hitler had come to power the year before. He was actively rearming. It looked like war was on the horizon, perhaps. And this film is a product of that time, and you should look for that. 1934, 1935. There is a strong anti-war theme running through this film. I think it's very interesting for an official film to have that. When it was unveiled and premiered in March of 1935, first shown in Ottawa, it attracted a number of people, and I'm finishing up here, and I don't want to tell you much more about this, except to say that there was a very strong reaction to this film. First in Ottawa, and then as it traveled, there was 8 copies that traveled across the country being seen. The Ottawa Citizen described it as a very fine film and one that documented the stupidity and fruitlessness of war. Personally, I don't think the message is that simple, but there is no glorification of war in this film, or very little, I think. Nonetheless, there was a need to tell the story, and Canada's fighting forces had achieved a significant reputation on the Western Front, and you'll see that come through here as well. The film excited much controversy. One review for the opening night said, "Come and see the film. Dress up and see the slaughter." quite a negative reaction there. There were heated exchanges in the House of Commons over the film, not over the messaging of the film, but over whether children should be allowed to see this film. Some thought that it was simply too much for them. We who live in the age of Saving Private Ryan and the far more terrible Pearl Harbor and films like that, know violence in a different way on film, but this was seen as quite shocking for the time. In fact, in one of the Senate debates, it was said that unemployed men, of which there were hundreds of thousands in Canada in 1935, should not be allowed to see the film because it would possibly militarize them and push them into the arms of communism. This was seen as a dangerous film. It was also seen as the most important film of the decade. It was said in many reviews that this was a film that had to be seen. The last showing I was able to find was in 1939, months before Canada went to war again against Germany. To my knowledge, it has not been shown many times, and I think it's quite unique that you tonight will have a chance to see it as we've just passed the 100th anniversary of the armistice. There are many things I could say about the film, but I'll leave you with one last thought, and then I think we can get on with it and see it. I'm excited to see it on the big screen. My thought is, what you are seeing here is all of the best Canadian film footage that was shot on the Western Front, that was shot in battle. We will never find more footage. This is it. It has been used and reused countless times. This is the footage. You will see it in the context of how the Legion and D&D and the Canadian government wish to first portray it for Canadians to help them tell the story of this awful, cataclysmic war. Thank you very much.
Well, here we go. This is a microphone. Oh, terrific. Well, it's the first time I've seen the film on the big screen as well, and so much is going through my head right now. I don't know where to start. I wanted to start with somewhere else. I'm not sure that we should start with the ending. When I see a film like this, Tim, there's two things I want to deal with as somebody who's obviously really interested in cinema. One is what's there. Maybe we can start with that. And then the second part of it, of course, is what's not there. And this film begs all of those questions, too. But why don't we start with what's there? When you've seen it now on the big screen, what do you take away, just in terms of, like, the faces, the things that are shown, the tone of that? I was thinking of that constantly through the film as I was watching it. You know, I was looking for people's faces and reactions. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what you've actually seen and what's presented through that.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. What's there and what's not there. What's there is a very detailed account of the war. I wrote 2 volumes, At the Sharp End and Shock Troops, and you know, a lot of what's in my book is on that screen. I think in terms of the narrative that you would try to tell in a strategic sense, and the start of the war, and then the Canadian story, and the series of battles, and we go from there. There's a lot on the fighting. There's a lot on logistics. There's a lot on guns. At the beginning, there's far too much on marching, as we know. But of course, that's where the cameras were. That's how you tell it. And I think you can tell the parts where they've reconstructed a battle, or they've taken from one of the 1920s war films. For me, there's power in seeing the faces of soldiers. It's always been that. When you see those images of the young guys on there, and sometimes not so young, I think there's great strength in that. And at the Canadian War Museum, where I'm a curator, it's a fabulous job. When I'm looking for a powerful image, it's usually eye contact. And that's something that I imagine filmmakers are doing the same now. For the absence, I won't go into all the details because there's a lot that's missing there. But I think the way we tell stories in 1935, obviously very different than how we would tell it in 2018. And in a blatant plug on my new book, The Secret History of Soldiers, I mean, I'm really trying to understand, how did these guys keep fighting? How did they keep going? I mean, we saw the strain and the destruction and the shell fire and the chemical weapons and the snipers, and that's the question. How could they keep going? And so my book looks at the cultural history of soldiers, the social history, the singing of the songs, which we saw in this film. The songs pop up quite a few times. The souveniring. By that means soldiers stealing anything they could get their hands on. That too is in the film. The theater, which I write about, but the dumbbells are represented.
Dumbbells, exactly.
And sports, and it goes on and on. So it's there, but they're little glimpses of it, and they don't draw attention to it in a way that maybe today we would do more of. And certainly I think we would emphasize more the individual soldiers. Who were these young guys for the most part? And how did they keep going, and the stress and the strain? Yeah, and there's the scenes that I guess that resonated the most with me were the scenes of the men in the trenches. You know, they were clearly, that was real footage that was shot. It was not in any kind of way reconstructed. It wasn't done at all there's no dramatization in that. And so you really see the actual awful conditions within which they fight or fought. The combat scenes, which of course you expect to be the most horrendous, for me were a funny mix of obviously real footage, artillery shells, etc., falling, but the combat scenes look completely false. I'm not sure whether this matters. I'm not sure if you can tease apart what was actually reconstruction or what was really a combat. Some of the soldiers, you know, going over the top and marching in long lines, et cetera, et cetera. But there's such, I mean, the first Battle of Ypres, I guess, when the Germans are attacking, it really is very stylized. And do you think this matters at all, Tim? I mean, I know this is the lens of many, many decades later. But the authenticity of it, maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because I think the moments that resonated with me, and maybe it was the same with the audience, are those moments of real authenticity. Whether it is the marching, you really do see they're off to war, and you realize what's going on there. And of course, at the end, it's the armistice, and they're waving their helmets as they realize that peace is, you know, the war is over. But talk a little bit about just your feelings of the reconstructions, the inauthentic versus the authentic in a film like this. Well, I certainly think the authentic material is stronger, more powerful, and conveys even 100 years later in a much stronger way than the battle scenes, which I imagine in 1935 were probably more the focus. I mean, to see that, you know, I'm not sure how discerning those people were, although the reviews of the film talk about it being the real thing, and they don't really distinguish between those battle scenes and the stuff we clearly know now. Just by seeing it, because we've seen so much, is clearly just taken from a film or a Hollywood film or something like that. That's not distinguished in the reviews of the time. So I wonder if, in fact, people were not able to distinguish those things. There was a very famous film, The Battle of the Somme, which depicts real footage from that, and it's a very powerful experience. And it was shown in 1916. 20 million people saw it in about 8 weeks, and people were fainting in the aisles, and they were breaking out into screams, and people were shouting up and pointing to their sons and fathers. It's a very powerful experience to see the war on film at that time. But I think 100 years later, for me, the strength is in the authentic. So let's talk a little bit about what's not there. Both, I guess, in an intimate way, what's some of the things that are not there, and maybe in a larger way. I mean, the conscription crisis is, of course, not touched on at all. I mean, maybe we could start with that. And I guess there's certain subjects, certain things. I mean, you're right. It's a very lucid PowerPoint, in a way, film about the Canadian involvement in the war, but it deals very little with, of course, the conscription crisis, very little with the home front. And there's a number of other things that I'll just touch on. You only see images of nurses at the very, very end. You only see one shot of wounded and maimed people at the very, very end.
you see, I was actually surprised, you see some black soldiers, but they're from the West Indies regiment, and there was, I think, a Canadian, quite a contingent, what, 4,000 black Canadians were involved?
Yeah.
And so maybe you just talk about these absences as well.
Yeah, I mean, almost the entire home front is missing from this. And I think in the 20s and 30s, the great emphasis was on the soldiers fighting overseas. I think if we think of the historiographical trends, it's really not until the 70s and 80s when we begin to think of the home front as well. Women involved, the elderly, children. Some of those things I was talking about before, the shell production and wheat and farming and the introduction of income tax. These are powerful legacies from the war, enfranchisement for women, and of course the dark legacy of the war, the conscription crisis that really tears the country apart along English and French lines, and those farmers and those in the cities, and community against community. So yeah, that's missing from the war, and from the film, and part of it is two things. Because I've seen the script for this. They talk a little bit about this, but they don't really have much footage. And you can see the beginning. Some of that Canadian footage is very interesting. Those were private film companies, and they generally consisted of one or two individuals, entrepreneurs, who went out and filmed the Canadians as they were leaving a community. And then they would set up, like a day later, a little theater, and they would show these, and they would get 2 to 3 weeks of this, and before people got tired of it. And there was an attempt after the war of the government to collect all of that, I guess we'd call it amateur footage, and to bring it together into this film.
One of the things that I don't even know about, and I should probably know more, is what the actual cameras looked like at the time. I mean, how big they were. I mean, I'm certainly very aware of what a studio camera looked like. I mean, the medium was it was less than 20 years old when the war broke out, and it was a very, very clumsy medium. So I don't know if you've ever seen. Have you ever seen a camera that was carried?
Yeah, we don't have one at the War Museum. The Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa has one, and these I've seen still photographs of the cameramen, and they're all shot on tripods, and they're quite large and bulky, and they're rectangular, and they have a hand crank to slowly move, and you really need to set up your shot, and you're not running back and forth with this thing or anything like that. So that's part of why I think we see a lot of footage of things marching past the camera. Right, because the camera is in a stable spot somewhere, and it was really interesting to read accounts of the cameramen, and I talk about this in my article on this and my book Cleo's Warriors, just their frustration, because they know what they want to shoot, they can see it, but when an artillery bombardment goes off of several 100,000 shells and tearing up, there's nothing to see. And when night operations go into effect, the Battle of Amiens at 5:20 or 4:20 in the morning, the Arras fight on the 26th of August at 3:30 in the morning, they're not able to get that. So there are all of these limitations. I think, though, despite that, it really is quite remarkable to see this footage. And those of you who have seen a lot of CBC documentaries or NFB films can see how all of this stuff gets used over and over again, including in this film where they use the same machine gunner shot 4 times and a few other things. We would tell the story differently today, right? We would embrace far more the diversity, I think, of the force. We talk about the African Canadians. We talk about the 4,000 Indigenous Canadians. We would talk about French Canadians and English Canadians working together. That's not here because that's really not the Canada of 1935.
It's pretty impressive the way the film ends. I mean, the tone of the film is quite, you're not really expecting it. You're expecting something more celebratory, more victorious, and it's completely the opposite. Do you think this was very much because of it was 1935, as you said in your introduction, there's that looming sense of another war, and of course nobody wanted another war, and so it is almost anti-war, I guess, is what people felt at the time. But certainly pro-peace.
Yeah, even then, I'm quite shocked by that ending, It's not a jaw dropper, but it's not what I would have expected from Canada's official film. And this was shown to the Bennett government, the cabinet. It was shown to Andy McNaughton, who was Army commander in the Second World War and head of the Army at this point. So this had the official seal, and it's a very, I think you'd have to say, anti-war ending, isn't it? And they see war is coming. And it's interesting to see, where does this fit in? This airs or is presented for the first time March of 1935. The previous year, in 1934, 75,000 veterans had descended on Toronto for the CEF reunion. It's the largest reunion to that point. And they shut down parts of the city, and the veterans came together. And it was really the first major return of veterans after the war. And then, of course, 1 year after this, the Vimy Memorial will be unveiled. And that's a key event. 6,000 veterans and their family members go to that. And so you can see also at the Vimy unveiling, a year closer, Hitler rearming, the Spanish Civil War will break out in 2 weeks after that. There's great fear there, and you see that in the speeches, and it picks up on this idea of the war to end all wars. Very quickly is seeming like not the war to end all wars, but it's the precursor to the next war, which everyone expects will be even more terrible, using all the weapons from the First World War, the tanks and the bombers and the fighters and the chemical weapons and the submarines. And there is great dread that this war is coming.
This elicited some controversy, as you said. There were films that were made after this that elicited a lot of controversy. Paul Cowan's film on Billy Bishop, The Kid Who Couldn't Miss. And then, of course, you and I were discussing prior to the screening, The Horror and the Valor, which is a film that I think it was the CBC and the NFB co-produced together on the Second World War, not on the First World War. But we seem to, as a country, have a very different view. I guess there's a variety of different perspectives on the war. Why do you think this is?
100 years on, we're still talking about the war. We're still reflecting on it. We're still haunted by it, I think. But it's a difficult war for us to talk about. We have pulled myths out of the war. The Vimy legend, as I have written about, is an important one to represent Canada stepping onto the world stage. But in French Canada, just as strong is the conscription story or the shootings in the streets in Quebec City. It's a difficult war to use, even though we have used it over the years to talk about nation building and progressing, because we do have the story of French Canada, and if you go beyond that, farmers and others. And I think it sits very uneasily in our history. The Australians, who are very similar to us, use their war experience in a very open nation-building way. The British have a very difficult time talking about the First World War, even though they won. They're focused so deeply on the Somme and the slaughter on the Somme. The French talk about the war very differently. They focus on Verdun, a battle in 1916 where they held off against the Germans. The Germans, of course, as we know, have a very difficult time talking about war no matter what in the 20th century. So how nations talk about wars is interesting. For Canada, we've had a difficult time, which isn't to say that we can talk about the Second World War in an easier way, because we never produced a film like this for the Second World War. There was a 10-part NFB series in 1962, but it seems not to have had much traction, and it certainly wasn't official in that way. And our primary film for the Second War, as you said, was The Valor and the Horror, which excited tremendous controversy among veterans. And I think, in a broad way, I think we, for whatever reason, Canadians have a difficult time engaging with their own history. And we just see that today. The challenge is The Story of Us, the recent attempt by the CBC to tell the story of Canada, which just had all kinds of controversy attached to it. But we have to. I mean, these are our stories. And if we don't talk about them, I think we run the real risk of certainly forgetting large parts of our history. And I think we're a mature enough nation, 150 years on now, that we should be able to engage with these difficult stories. We should be able to talk about the service and sacrifice in the First World War, and also talk about the horror and the tragedy of it. And I think the Second World War is a bit of a different story, but something we must talk about as well.
Your piece in the Globe this weekend really pushes well beyond Vimy and the myth of Vimy, which I thought it was a really lovely piece in the sense it was so measured and so weighted. Do you really think that the Canada was born, is founded, not because of Vimy, but in a broader sense? And that's what I loved about your piece, because you actually touch on a lot of other things that were going on politically, socially, in the country at that point in time, that obviously the First World War impacted all of those things. So was Canada born out of this moment?
A different Canada is born out of the war, but that's different than saying that Canada is born in war. I think we are constantly inventing who we are as a people, reinventing ourselves. We go through various cycles. If someone was to say right now, what is the most important event in Canada, 30, 40 years from now, what will they think about? Well, certainly it'll be reconciliation and the Indigenous question. It'll be something about oil. It'll be something about ongoing quest for human rights and diversity. If you were to ask 25, 30 years ago, what's the key question? I'm not sure any of those would be. It would be something about the Quebec question, which defined us as a people for 30 or 40 years. And if you were to go back 30 or 40 years, it's something about coming out of the Second World War. And so we are continually changing and evolving, and there are events in our history where we swerve and we become something different. And I think the First World War is one of those. 50 years after Confederation, this traumatic event, something that was quite unlike anything we had ever done before, and led to fundamental changes and legacies. And yes, we have to say that a different Canada emerged from that war. But the Canada of 1919 or the 1920s is not the Canada today.
And I would add to those periods you've gone through, the Canadian military as peacekeepers, because there was a certain moment, I think, in the 60s, 50s and 60s, where we really had, and probably into the 70s as well, maybe even a little bit later, the Canadian military had this real tradition of being peacekeepers, UN, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we have a very proud history of peacekeeping. I think if you look at peacekeeping in Canada, how we present ourselves on the world stage, that was a key part of who we were in the second half of the 20th century. The key thing there is to say the second half of the 20th century. If you look at the first half of the 20th century, South African War, First World War, Second World War, Korean War, and the Depression. I mean, what a time to live in. There's no peacekeeping going on there. And peacekeeping has gone through changes. The traditional Pearsonian peacekeeping of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even early 90s died in Rwanda, died in Bosnia, died in Somalia. And what we have now is something quite different. As Afghanistan revealed, that was aspects of peacekeeping mixed with peacemaking, mixed with full-on modern warfare. So
building on the piece you wrote in the Globe, which in a very succinct way describes what the First World War did to Canada, what do you think you would pull out of the Second World War and how that affected this country?
We have this focus on the First World War so deep and so strong. 100 years on, it's in our symbolic landscape. It's Remembrance Day, 2 minutes of silence, the poppy. We contribute even more in the Second World War. 1.1 million Canadians served in the Second World War. We fought around the globe. We contributed even more significantly in a military way and also in an industrial home front production. And yet we have a very strange memory of the Second World War. If you look at our textbooks, if you look at how we talk about that war, we have this tremendous focus on Dieppe, a shocking defeat, and on the relocation of Japanese Canadians on the home front. And that those are two stories that are still with us. Very few Canadians can tell you anything about the Battle of the Atlantic, the key role that we played in Fighter Command or in the bombing campaign. Probably could tell you something about D-Day, but have no idea how we got to the end of the war. And so the stories we tell are very different, and this is something that I'm trying to explore right now. And part of it is the stories we tell, the books, the plays, the novels. We have a far stronger tradition of First World War than Second World War in the cultural landscape. And it's interesting in many ways, and I think it has something to do with how we welcome the veterans back in the Second World War, the importance of the Veterans Charter. The First World War veterans came back to a broken country, a country in debt. We didn't treat them very well. The Second World War, we treated our veterans, we could afford to treat them in a much more significant and positive way. They had loans to start businesses, 40,000 went to university, they had land grants, and Canada emerges from that war relatively wealthy, tied to the United States financially. And so we emerge from that war, 1/3 of Canadian adult males are veterans, but we quickly forget about it. And part of it has to do with peacekeeping, and part of it has to do how we don't tell our stories very well, and how we read the British books and the American books and the German books. And we get to the point in 1992 when The Valor and the Horror comes out, and the veterans who saw that were outraged. I mean, they just took this as a blow to their history, to their fallen comrades. And I won't go into all the details. You may know The Valor and the Horror, but one of them condemned the bombing campaign and equated the Canadian and British actions to that of the Germans. And from that point forward, the veterans began to fight more for their own history. And I think we can mark that, and we can see the change. 1994, 95, tens of thousands of Canadian veterans go back to Europe. They're greeted as liberators. Canadians wake up to the fact that we have this generation of veterans who we've ignored. And then it continues to move forward. The new Canadian War Museum, Remembrance Day ceremonies that become stronger. And all of this happening, ironically, I think, as we're losing our Second World War veterans. And we're down to about 25,000 or so. They're 94, 95 years old. And I guess it'll be one of those questions of what happens when we lose our last Second World War veteran. When we have severed that link, we've already lost it to the First World War. But when we lose our last Second World War veteran, how will we think about war?
Maybe we told our stories better in the First World War, actually. I mean, Beaverbrook's innovations were extraordinary, as you said. I mean, the funny little anecdote you said about how they looked as if the Canadians were actually the only ones fighting the war. Yeah. And maybe I'll say something glib here. Maybe the Second World War, of course, was taken over by the Americans. So the great storytelling came out of them. Maybe a little bit the British, but mostly the Americans, of course. So our stories were just relatively minor, and we didn't have the opportunity to tell them quite the same way. And of course, the Americans came so late to the First World War, they didn't have the opportunity to tell their stories in quite the same way.
I think you're exactly right. The Americans assume, and perhaps rightly, that they won the Second World War. The Soviet Union thinks they won the war. The British feel that they won the war, and Canada would never say that, but we would say that we certainly contributed to the winning of that war. But I think it has to do with the way we tell our stories, and there's something in the Canadian character, I think, where we don't wave the flag and we don't beat our chests, and perhaps that's because we live next to the Americans and they're so good at that. And I'm okay with that, the quiet Canadian. But it does have detriment at some point, that if we don't tell our stories, don't expect the French to tell them, don't expect the British to tell them, and certainly don't expect the Americans to tell them. And in fact, what the Americans will do, as with Argo and things, is they'll steal our stories and make them into their own. And that's a self-inflicted wound.
Let's go over to you guys for questions. Maybe we can turn the lights up so Tim and I can actually see you, or I can see to identify. Go ahead.
Hello. You've done an excellent job exploring how this documentary we saw reflected the history. How did it create history? What was its impact? How did it perhaps change things?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the challenges for scholars or writers talking about cultural products like this is, how do you assess the impact? You know, we can look at box office sales, which were considerable for this film. We can look at the number of theaters and where it played. It played across the country. We can look at reviews, as I have, and there came down on both sides. Some people saying that this is the authentic story. Finally, we've got it. Caveat, finally, we have a story to tell the Americans, and that was a driver of this as well. Others saying, this isn't nearly capturing the experience of war, that this is not, this is some form of publicity or propaganda or something, but doesn't really get at the heart of it. How does it shape the memory of the First World War? I think it's a part of the evolution of memory that occurs from building of the monuments and memorials in the 20s to the reunion I spoke about in 34, to Vimy, and the same group that made this, the Government Motion Picture Bureau, filmed the Vimy story and put out a film of that in 1937. That wasn't nearly as successful. I don't think we can say that this film, or at least I can't prove that it had a tremendous impact on how people saw the war, except that it helped to tell our story. And there were very few histories that emerged from the war because they were all waiting for that official history, that 8-volume history that never was written. So I think you can see how this film is carrying a bit of that weight of really desperate to try to tell every part of the story. And in parts, it feels quite laden down by that need to tell that story.
I'll add to that question. How do you feel about the treatment of the leaders in this film? Curry being one of them, who was kind of mentioned but not really positioned in a funny way. Sam Hughes is sort of there. You know, you've written about this conflict, this battle post-war. Of course, the First World War, there's a sense that the generals did a terrible, terrible job. But I think the Canadian leadership has actually been, quite praised. Certainly Curry has been one of the most, the smartest generals, I guess, if that's the way to term it in the war. But how do you think this film deals with the leadership and that delicate
it's
notion?
very neutral. I think it doesn't condemn. Sir Douglas Haig comes off quite well here. I think most historians would have sharper things to say about his command. What's very strange is how Curry is so... he's not in this film at all. I mean, he's shown twice, I think, and at the end taking the salute. That's odd. He's our most significant battlefield general. He leads the Canadians. He has since become a Canadian icon. And helps to represent that evolution of the fighting forces and the professionalization. Maybe he wasn't at the time. I think he was, because in fact he dies in 1933. He dies in the end of November 1933. His funeral in Montreal was said to be the largest in Canadian history, even more than Laurier and Sir John A. Macdonald. But he had fought this very difficult court case in 1928 in Cobourg, Ontario, where his reputation was questioned. He was accused of sending Canadians into Mons on the last day of war, and that Canadians were slaughtered under his command. It wasn't true. It was accusations made by Sir Sam Hughes, who actually comes off quite well in this film, and then repeated in a small town newspaper. So that's a very odd thing, I think, how Curry is depicted here, and really how he just doesn't appear to have almost any role here, and any history today would have a much stronger focus on Curry.
Any of the divisional commanders or senior officers alive to have commented on this film? Are you aware of any of that, Tim?
Yeah, most of them, I think they're all alive, in fact, the 4 divisional commanders, and at least 2 of them were involved in it. The 1st Division commander and the 2nd, Burstall and McDonnell, and they were champions of Curry. So again, it's a bit odd. And McNaughton, who was involved in this, deeply respected Curry as well. So there's footage of Curry that is not in here that I have seen, and perhaps it's the nature of it. The film kind of rushes towards the conclusion at the end, I think. I think they spend a bit too much on the front end and trying to set it up, and the middle parts, and there isn't enough really on what Curry would do. And perhaps that's one of the flawed natures of the film, in that even though they were planning this for years, they carry it off. There are probably some filmmakers in the room, but they write the script in something like 3 weeks or something. And maybe that's common, but that seemed to be quite rushed.
Yeah, the focus on the Royal Navy I found surprising. Coronel and the Falcons and all that stuff, which had nothing to, it had a lot to do with the war, but had very little to do with Canadian participation. Anyway, next question. Mr. Flack here. Jim, you got a microphone.
In Mons, there is a museum, and in the museum, they have some film of Curry. And what is interesting about that film is it's silent film, but they use lip readers to tell what he was saying. And they've made a sort of a significant segment, several minutes, of his planning the battle, or one of the battles that's taking place. And I'd say he gets more credit there. The question I had is, who were the decision makers deciding what went into the film, and was there a political aspect, or was there a government control aspect?
Mm-hmm. It is a government film. The key filmmaker is Badgley, Frank Badgley, who was head of the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau. And the writer of it was, his name escapes me, but he was a veteran of the war and twice decorated with the Military Cross. And they seem to have largely done it themselves. And they had a committee that recommended aspects, as these things have, that included Sir Arthur Doughty, the Dominion archivist, and McNaughton, and a few other senior commanders. There doesn't appear to have been a lot of... it was shown to the Bennett cabinet, and they asked for one change, and I think it had to do, there was a reference to conscription. Now that we talked about that, and they asked to remove that because it was still a very raw and difficult thing to talk about, especially for a conservative government. But I wouldn't say it was interfered with by the ministers at all. They feared it, though, and they worried what the backlash would be, and there wasn't anything beyond the normal, I think, exchange of debates in newspapers.
Over here.
Do you think it would be possible to make an accurate portrayal of Canada's involvement in Afghanistan today?
Yes. Although I think it's very much a still unsettled operation. I think in terms of writing modern events, we're moving out of the journalistic phase and memoir phase into something where historians will begin to grapple with it. But I think we're still very much there, and some very fine journalistic works that many of us in this room have read. But they're episodic, and how one puts together the full story. For a filmmaker, I think, to tell that full story, you would need a solid history to base it upon. I think we certainly have enough footage, if that's the word, to tell it visually. But I think to figure out what the story is would be very complex. And I think in terms of filmmaking now being far more sophisticated than what we may have seen on screen here, a filmmaker undertaking that would do so at great peril, I think, until we still have an opportunity to understand. I'm thinking of how one would write a history of this and then visually present it. But I hope someone tries. I think it would be brave. I think it would be necessary. And the Afghanistan mission, or I think we can fairly call it war, how would you end it? Would maybe be the key question. I think we know how we got in. I think we're not quite sure what the end is, and how do you tell the story of a war that is still going on? Very difficult.
Anybody else have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Can we get a mic to you?
It's actually a comment that despite the evident limitations and the absences of this work, I think it's really, really important that it has been preserved. And I personally think there would be some merit to seeing that it was screened in certain history classes at whatever level, I don't know, if for no other reason than to serve as a starting point, a jumping off point for a much broader and wider discussion of the First World War, of Canada's participation in it, and of war itself, for that matter. But, and I, frankly, was far more, in some ways, affected by it and impressed by it, considering when it was made and under the conditions that it was made, and the state of development or not yet development of film culture itself. So that's my response to it. And I'd never was not at all aware of its existence, and I'm very much interested in so many accounts of and interpretations of the Great War. So that's my comment.
Thank you. I think that's a great comment, and I have shown this in classes at Carleton when I've taught there, and talking about some of the things that you've raised there, to show it, to talk about what was documented, some of the silences. It's a really interesting jumping off point. The second film that I sometimes show is the Passchendaele one by Paul Gross, and it has its own limitations and the need to inject a love story into Passchendaele and all that. And that one I talk about in a different way, and how we envision war over and over again, and how we make and remake war. And I think that these are this is the stuff that we can really let students with some supporting documentation really talk about, and it really gets great discussions going.
I've spent my entire career thinking and writing and looking at Canadian cinema. I was aware of this film when I was about 20 in the 1970s, and I saw it for the first time this year. So that probably tells you something about just how Canadian films are shown, screened on, and how we see them. It was I just never had the possibility. I actually went online and, of course, found it there online because I was doing the research for this series. But I have never seen this on the big screen. I've been associated with film organizations for the last 40 years, and it's never been screened. So it's a very good point. But Canadians just simply don't know about this film. It's just, Tim's done this wonderful article that you should read in, what is it, military history?
Canadian military history, and it's online, so you can just Google it. It's called
there you go.
Lest We Forget, and
yeah, we don't know much about our own history. Anyone else, or is this... One more question. Well, why don't we go here to
as an American, it's in a comment here. So it's funny seeing, not funny, but seeing the film. As an American, I never had exposure to the Canadian experience. So like Vimy Ridge, all that stuff was never talked about in the American history books. It's all about Americans went over 2 million strong. We won the war. It was all glamorized by Hollywood. So it's very interesting to see this real live interpretation and presentation of the war, just as a comment. But so it's very interesting to see this. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And one of the emphasis on the official and the authentic here, even though there is reconstructions here, was to combat the Hollywood films, and deliberately you see that throughout. And there's a feeling that the fictionalized films are not telling the right stories, and that if we should present it and with the authentic images and moving film, and that's a real driving force here, as well as combating a little bit of what you just said there. You know, how the Americans claim to have won the war and came in and cleaned it up at the end. Yeah. No, and that drove Canadians bonkers. I mean, they were really they're all through the 20s. They're continually saying, "Why can't we get our story out there?" And they're looking for all these things, and this film is a part of that.
One of the interesting things when I did the research for this series is the number of American filmmakers who made films on the non-American experience. And that actually continued not just in the interwar period, but in the post-war period too. I mean, one of the most famous films, of course, is Positive Glory, Stanley Kubrick's film. Joseph Losey, an American film, again, King and Country. But the interwar period, John Ford made 4 films on the First World War, and Howard Hawks made 4 films, and I don't think any of them are actually the American experience. So they put themselves into the French, into the German. Of course, Louis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front is an American filmmaker making a film about the German army. So it was an interesting phenomenon that the Americans, of course, think that the 2 million that came in after 1917 sort of won the war, but at the same time, the filmmakers were, many of them were actually making films on a non-American experience. And some of those films are fantastic, actually. Strange that they didn't do that a little bit about the Second World War, I guess. There's certainly American filmmakers who made films about non-American experiences.
I think it'd be fair to say that that in the United States the emphasis is on the American Civil War, which is still vibrant and raw. That the First World War, World War I, as it's called in the United States, largely ignored, and then the Second World War just absolutely crucial, and you see it in countless films, and that's the touchstone. And then, of course, Vietnam, and now I assume Afghanistan and Iraq. So for a long time, the Americans didn't pay a lot of attention to World War I, other than the fact that they had won it. And but now it has come back around a little bit more, and there are more scholars, and I think we are seeing more interest in the United States, and that's a good thing.
Do we have one more last question, and then we should let Tim go?
I was also wondering, in terms of the documentary footage we saw, was there any particular scenes that were atypical of the war or unusual in their representation of this particular time snippet they showed of combat or of events?
So unusual insofar as using 1918 footage in 1916, or something, or just something unusual to see?
Atypical in the sense that, yes, they're accurate, but they don't necessarily represent the general going-ons that occur.
Well, I think all of the battle scenes are generally not how they engage in battle. Their tactics are not a whole bunch of men moving over the battlefield in tight clusters, right? That's you become a very good target for machine gun fire, and more importantly for mortar and artillery fire. So in fact, it's much more spread out, and that's one of the challenges. The empty battlefield, and even in advancing, it's really difficult to catch in the camera frame a battalion of men, which is 1,000 guys, or probably 700 who go over the top. How do you simply get that? And there's that quite nice scene, I think it's in the battle for the Drocourt-Quéant line, where the Canadians are sort of winding their way through barbed wire and moving up in a kind of position, and they're all funneling through there, and it actually shows probably 200 or 300 men. I thought that was quite an interesting scene, which I don't think I'd seen before. I think the air war segments are quite powerful, and some of that comes from some of those films done in the 1920s, but some of it looks quite authentic to me. So that has surprised me that material has survived. And of course, we've seen that over and over again in other productions.
Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much for introducing the film and adding so many interesting comments to our reaction to it as well. So we wish you the best of luck with your future books. We look forward to reading them, and thank you so much for coming to be a part of this series.
Thank you very much.
It's great.